Hi, everyone. Welcome, welcome. Thanks so much for joining. We'll get started here in a couple of minutes. Thanks for joining.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Chela Garcia Irlando. I'm the Executive Director of the Next 100 Coalition. We are a national environmental advocacy organization based across the country. And I wanted to share a little bit about today's webinar and our team. Karen Bigelow, who could not join us today, is our Director of Conservation Programs and Advocacy. Jonathan Terrell is our Program Manager. And the Next 100 Coalition is really working with our, AI data centers and conservation portfolio to build leadership at the intersection of AI and environment by raising awareness for environmental impacts of data center development and AI policies. I want to make it very clear we're not anti-AI. We just want to make sure that AI is being held accountable and really serving communities and protecting the environment above just lining the pockets of the mega wealthy and ultra, connected. In our ongoing webinar series, we are engaging with experts such as Fatima in infrastructure, energy, and water issues to learn more about the challenges and opportunities for local communities and environments where data centers are being built. And we continue to engage decision makers and partners at the NGO level to learn more about solutions to the very big challenges that are ahead as data centers continue to be developed across the country. Today, we are excited to discuss the federal government's plans for AI data centers policy, explore alternatives that ensure data centers can be good neighbors to our communities and ecosystems. And with that, I will turn it over to Jonathan. I appreciate you all joining today.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks, everyone, for joining. My name is Jonathan Terrell. I use he, him pronouns. I'm based in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And as Chela said, I'm the program manager for the Next 100 team, and I've been supporting in our AI conservation and data centers portfolio. Today, I'm really grateful to be joined by Fatima Ahmad, the CEO of AI for Energy, to talk a little bit about the current federal policy landscape, give folks on the call an understanding of what's going on, and some of the concerns and alternatives that we at the Next 100 are looking into and looking at today. We'll be talking about three different pieces today. The Trump AI plan and two pieces of legislation recently introduced into Congress. That is the AI Uniformity Act, as well as the SANDBOX Act. I'll turn it over to Fatima to hear some thoughts from her, as well as some of the things that she is doing as part of her organization. And there'll be time for Q&A with you all at the end. So feel free to use the Q&A function in the webinar anytime during the conversation to raise questions. We want to make this as interactive as possible, but also we'll make sure we'll leave time for dedicated Q&A toward the end. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started with an overview of the AI action plan. So in July 2025, the Trump administration released a document titled Winning the Race, America's AI Action Plan. The document outlines three pillars. Those are accelerating AI innovation, building American AI infrastructure, and leading in international AI diplomacy and security. At a high level, the plan outlines different strategies to remove what the Trump administration has deemed regulatory barriers to AI development and streamline pathways for AI and data center development. Each pillar of the plan outlines policy recommendations to accomplish the document and the administration's major goals for AI innovation. Today, I'll be briefly reviewing some of the environmental implications of this plan and the two pieces of legislation, like I named before, the SANDBOX Act and the AI Uniformity Act, that are intended to implement this via legislative pathways in the House and Senate. So to start at the first pillar, the plan makes recommendations to implement broad strategies across the federal government to, quote, create conditions where private sector-led innovation can flourish. Among other things, this directs federal agencies, such as the Office of Science and Technology Policy, or OSTP, the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, and other agencies to review existing policy for revision or repeal it as if it is an obstruction to private sector AI development. This includes making funding decisions to limit AI-related funding to states with regulatory approaches which differ from this administration's approach to AI infrastructure. That includes things like taking a look at some previous legislative pathways, including the AI moratorium that was attempted to pass in July of this past year to remove state funding related to technology that are dissimilar to the Trump and this federal administration's AI action plan. The concern that we have here is the ambiguity. Understanding what is ambiguous or what is obstructive is something that has been poorly defined. It really could lead to the opposition of some of our bedrock environmental policies and processes, such as public comment periods and rulemaking processes, such as the National Environmental Policy Act, to be changed to accelerate adoption rather than receive community feedback and scientific review from experts. This is very much in line with where folks might otherwise be tracking attacks from the Trump administration on critical environmental laws that promote community rights to protect themselves from corporate overreach and from bad actors. Additionally, Pillar 1 recommends prioritizing research into scaling manufacturing technologies across research and development agencies throughout the federal government. This includes agencies such as the Department of Energy, the Department of Defense, the Army Corps of Engineers, lots of the implementers of these federal programs. And while this section does not specifically address supply or demand side issues, that is Pillar 1, there are reports that scaling up some of these pieces of manufacturing in the way that the Trump administration's plan is describing them, this kind of no holds barred, throwing spaghetti at the wall approach, will only compound the existing issues related to mineral and energy-based extractions, as well as some of the pieces that are creating environmental injustices, both domestically and globally. Pillar 2 of this sort of three-pillar plan is really a key focus for the Next 100 Coalition because it's talking specifically about built environment. There are multiple sections of this that hammer home some of the pieces that I just mentioned, including supporting streamlined semiconductor manufacturing, which in turn creates greater demand for critical mineral extraction, both domestically and abroad. Some of our key concerns, and one of the things that if you're attending this webinar, I want you to walk away from, that this is another attack on the National Environmental Policy Act, the Clean Water Act, and the Clean Air Act that we've seen in multiple places through this Trump administration and the previous one. There is a key provision in the Trump AI Action Plan to establish categorical exclusions under NEPA for the built infrastructure of AI. that is AI data centers, hyperscaler facilities, those that we might have already been watching. If you're joining this webinar and you're interested in AI, you might be tracking Elon Musk's Colossus facility in Memphis, Tennessee. That's, I think, really piqued folks' interests and raised broader awareness for some of the environmental harms that these data centers, if not properly, regulated and worked with to become good neighbors to local communities and environments, can kind of get out of control, as is happening in South Memphis. More specifically, the Trump AI Action Plan is a proposition to streamline or reduce regulations under the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act, and take away a valuable tool for communities to advocate for their rights in holding data center developers accountable for both environmental and public health harms. In the case of Memphis specifically, has been pointed out by other folks that are working more closely on the issue than we are at Next 100, the Clean Air Act was a key tool for local advocates and folks working in the space to say the way that energy is being generated for this data center is in violation of this act and needs to be paused or pivoted in order to be in alignment. Giving categorical exclusions and finding ways to circumvent these pieces of important environmental legislation and policy will potentially create additional environmental harms like we're seeing in Memphis, and allow companies, big tech corporations, some of the wealthiest folks, not only in the US, but throughout the world, to benefit with a significantly lessened degree of accountability. Unsurprisingly, there are also provisions in Pillar 2 to build out grid infrastructure. And while energy demand, reliability, and affordability are key issues that we're tracking as a piece of this, we're concerned that this plan specifically supports a broader agenda to prevent the cycling off of extractive energy resources and contribute to the broader suite of climate and conservation problems that causes. The plan specifically hopes to prevent what is, quote, the premature decommissioning of critical power sources, which, if you're following any other piece of the Trump administration, means keeping coal plants online for longer than necessary, especially given the access to renewable energy resources that could otherwise power these new pieces of energy-intensive infrastructure. Finally, in Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, there are recommendations to invest in workforce development opportunities. However, as we've covered in previous webinars, and happy to share links to folks with that, the demand for jobs in data centers is often significantly overstated. Many folks that are working in this issue feel like the workforce development benefit is a bit of a red herring in this discussion, with overstated benefits versus the real world implications of these facilities for long-term high-paying jobs. We're concerned that most of the workforce development opportunities are ultimately temporary rather than permanent. As to quote Amy Sherma with Science for Georgia, in some cases, data center facilities employ fewer people than a fast food chain like McDonald's. Finally, Pillar 3 focuses on international diplomacy and security actions. I wanted to just mention it to be well-rounded in kind of the overall presentation of this AI action plan. While these aren't necessarily Next 100's current focus, we're dedicated to working with folks across different sectors in this issue to understand how we can be intersectional and collective in our building awareness for all of the different ways that AI and data centers can be better. I have to really specifically give a shout out to the Kairos Learning Labs Fellowship Program, the first session of which I just finished attending earlier today, for an awesome metaphor using the movie Wicked to talk about the way big tech companies are using AI for unethical purposes, such as international surveillance. I think there's a lot of different ways that companies, organizations, and decision makers are approaching this issue, where a lot of education needs to occur, and we need to be good about resourcing each other across the nonprofit space. So if you're working on this issue and you find that there's a relevant environmental intersection, or if it feels like the partnership of an organization like Next 100 would be fruitful to bring broader awareness to our mutual portfolios, please feel free to reach out. I think none of these pillars can be really examined in isolation, as they're all part of a broader plan. I think one large advantage for folks who are concerned about this plan is that it's all laid out, much like the kind of backbone of the Trump administration's strategy going into this, that is Project 2025. There's a lot of things that are being said out loud with this Trump AI action plan that give us the opportunity to anticipate and find pathways for opposition or even potential collaboration with folks across the political and ideological spectrum. That's a little bit on the AI action plan. I'm seeing some come in asking if there's any things. We'll make sure to share that if you're registered for this webinar with folks. Feel free, if you have any other questions, to drop them in the chat over these three pillars, or if there's any comments that you have that come to mind on things that you've noticed as you've reviewed this of your own. If not, I'm going to continue moving to talk about some of the congressional actions that are currently being taken to implement these in the halls of Congress. I'm going to talk about two different pieces of introduced legislation, the SANDBOX Act and the AI Uniformity Act, to discuss this piece. SANDBOX Act is otherwise known as the Strengthening Artificial Intelligence, Normalization, and Diffusion by Oversight and Implementation Act, the SANDBOX Act. What this is the first legislative proposal to begin congressional tracks to implement the White House's AI action plan. The SANDBOX Act was introduced to the Senate in September 2025 as part of a broader legislative framework penned by Senator Ted Cruz to advance the Trump administration's AI goals. In short, the SANDBOX Act would give technology companies the ability to request a 2-year waiver from any federal regulations that they find obstructive to AI development, including the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and the National Environmental Protection or Policy Act, NEPA. So that's a concern, especially given this federal administration's approach to these pieces of legislation. It's advocating for this regulatory sandbox, so that way innovators can, quote unquote, do their thing and understand the ways that federal policy can be shaped around the needs of private entities, and again, some of the wealthiest of the wealthy across the country. The other thing that is particularly concerning from a process standpoint is the ability of the federal government to consolidate decision-making power within the ultimate kind of approving agency here, that is, again, the Office of Science and Technology Policy. One of the concerns is that in the process of applying for or requesting a waiver of relevant environmental policy that should go through, let's say, an agency like the Department of the Interior, if the agency lead does not respond within the allocated amount of time to the request, it is, in the language of the SANDBOX Act, automatically granted. This is leading some experts to share concerns that there may be a flood the zone tactic, where many folks who are seeking waivers will sort of create a flood of requests, and with this lack of oversight, be allowed to continue on without review from the public, from experts, etc. Additionally, if the lead of an agency that is relevant to the piece of federal policy is being requested, the SANDBOX Act creates a provision for the Office of Science and Technology Policy to give it a second look. And if the waiver has been denied, to say yes, to grant the waiver, even if the relevant federal agency finds that it is, not obstructive and it is an environmental concern. This is, again, I think, a tactic that we're seeing time and time again by the Trump administration, where we're taking some of the mission of agencies and consolidating them further and further up the chain of command to a very specific office that, in addition to giving a lack of due process, doesn't have some of the technical capacity that other agencies might have. This is very different from the idea of crafting a policy that will help data center developers be good neighbors to local communities. It really can feel like, I think, a blank check whenever it comes to any policy that might be found obstructive. This SANDBOX Act is part of a broader congressional legislative framework for AI regulation. This 5-pillar framework, we won't go into full detail of today, but I wanted to highlight the third pillar. The SANDBOX Act is the first of, which includes a provision to prevent a patchwork of burdensome AI regulation. This is described by clarifying federal standards to prevent burdensome state AI regulations. This is very similar to the moratorium that Ted Cruz introduced earlier this year during the reconciliation process at the beginning of this summer, and would be, in our opinion, an infringement on states' rights. I think that was something that was shared by a broad bipartisan coalition, and it's still, afoot. I think the big thing to keep track of with this legislative framework, the SANDBOX Act, and future pieces of legislation that will be introduced to implement and kind of secure this framework, are similar tactics, which I think a lot of people on both sides of the aisle have already said no to. There's also a piece specifically that kind of revives the AI moratorium currently active in the House. This bill was introduced by Republican Michael Baumgartner, who represents the eastern part of the state of Washington. The official title of the bill is the American Artificial Intelligence Leadership and Uniformity Act, which I'm calling for short the AI Uniformity Act. And this, again, creates a 5-year moratorium on state or local regulations that would impede the development of AI technologies and data centers. Similar to the moratorium earlier this year, the language is very ambiguous as to what obstructive, impeding, that kind of restrictive piece would look like. Additionally, the bill creates a federal task force to review existing state and federal regulations which negatively impact data center development. This is a really key piece that's pulled straight from the Trump AI plan. Instead of crafting a bipartisan piece of legislation, they're relying on this task force to establish a national AI action plan to implement pieces of the Trump executive order and AI plan. were concerned of the way that this bill in its current language would cause the overrule of decisions made at the local and state level, being a potential infringement upon states' rights, and really taking away the abilities of local communities to make decisions for the way that their natural resources, their land, and other pieces can be used that fit within the context of their community. The two bills, that are introduced right now seem to work together, stripping away some of the strength of environmental protection policies at the federal level and taking a look at state environmental policies that also might be obstructive. So that way, ultimately, together, the two bills and more, I'm sure, to come, will essentially pave the way for unregulated or significantly deregulated AI and data center technology policy. I'm going to stop there. Again, feel free to drop a question into the Q&A about the SANDBOX Act or the AI Uniformity Act. But I would love to turn it over to our guest speaker today, Fatima Ahmad. For a quick introduction, is the founder and CEO of AI for Energy, a strategic advisory firm that helps companies deploy AI to solve energy challenges. Previously, Fatima was a senior vice president for clean energy at Boundary Stone Partners, where she worked with partners across the clean energy and climate tech ecosystem to accelerate development of new energy technologies. Fatima also served as senior counsel on the House Select Committee on Climate Crisis, where she worked on the Congressional Climate Crisis Action Plan that led to the Energy Act of 2020, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and the Inflation Reduction Act. During the Obama administration, Fatima served as a political appointee at the Department of the Interior, where she helped license 10,000 megawatts of wind, solar, and geothermal energy before the end of her first term. She served as an attorney advisor at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association, or NOAA, and in private practice as an environmental lawyer at Pillsbury Winthrop Shaw. Fatima obtained her JD from the University of Chicago Law School and her BA with distinction in foreign affairs from the University of Virginia. Fatima, thanks so much for joining us. I'm happy to turn the floor to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here, and thank you all for making time for this really important conversation. I think AI, it has the potential to be as transformative as electricity, but I think we can't leave it to the technologists to shape the future of this. I think it needs all of us participating, understanding what's going on, shaping the future with our values in order to make sure that we can capture the upside of these technologies and limit any potential downside. So I think that one thing I would just wanted to start out by saying is that, the biggest limiter to AI deployment right now is access to energy. And so you might think, well, I'm hearing about all of these policies. They don't sound like things that I would support. Is there any way to support the build out of AI to capture that upside without some of these policy ideas? And I guess I would just take it back to, as Jonathan mentioned, I was a congressional staffer, and we came up with an action plan for Congress on the climate crisis. And our whole theory of the case was, if you can clean up the power sector, get to 100% clean energy, then you can electrify vehicles and buildings, maybe some industrial applications. And then, yeah, maybe there will be some hard to decarbonize sectors, and we'll need some additional technologies, but a clean power grid is really the linchpin of economy-wide decarbonization. And so that same strategy would make sense to power AI as well. So we can talk about that, but I just wanted to share that as my initial comment, is that there is a way to talk about powering AI that doesn't require increasing a lot of local air pollution and harmful climate pollution in communities.
Thanks so much, Fatima. I've got some questions for you to answer, and I'll invite folks to go up in the chat as well. But I want to start again by saying thanks for being here and talking more about these policies. To get us started, I'm curious, from your perspective, some of the implications that the Trump AI Action Plan and these two pieces of policy that are currently in the House and Senate have for existing environmental and energy policies?
Yeah, thanks for that nice review of the different pillars of the AI action plan. So that second pillar on energy infrastructure, as I mentioned, the biggest holdup to building out data centers and deploying AI is access to energy. And so that AI action plan has two goals. The first one is streamline permitting for data centers, semiconductor manufacturing, and energy infrastructure. And the second one is about the grid. So if we start with the first one, streamlining permitting, the data centers themselves actually don't need a lot of federal permits unless they are on federal land. And that's a new initiative. On its way out, the Biden-Harris administration proposed this idea of using DOE lands, DOD lands for data center and energy infrastructure. And that was something that the Trump administration picked up and is continuing to implement. But prior to that, there were really not that many federal permits that data centers needed. It's really more about the energy infrastructure that supports those data centers. And if you're kind of focused on reducing, Clean Air Act regulations, Clean Water Act, CERCLA, which is a Superfund law, this is really about fossil infrastructure. It's not really about clean energy, right? And so the net benefit, the net result is going to be more local air pollution, more harmful climate pollution, because you're leaning on fossil fuels being how you're going to power AI. And as I mentioned at the outset, that doesn't have to be how you do it, but this is kind of the approach that they're leaning in on. That second pillar, that second part of pillar two, develop a grid to match the pace of AI innovation. Here we see some good ideas and some less helpful ideas. So on the positive side, they talk about increasing the efficiency of the existing electric grid using grid enhancing technologies and advanced conductors. And advanced conductors, if you think about transmission, there's the poles and the wires. And the wires, you can replace them with newer ones called advanced conductors that carry more electricity. So suddenly you're getting a lot more power moving over the same infrastructure. So this approach is actually great for the environment. It's great for, increasing electrification. But on the negative side, as Jonathan mentioned, there's discussion about keeping coal plants online longer and connecting more new gas plants. And again, that's just going to increase local air pollution and harmful climate pollution. And it's not the only way to go about powering AI.
Yeah, as we're kind of talking more about energy reliability, particularly as a consequence of new demands on the grid, I'm curious, what are some of the implications of this plan on energy affordability, reliability, the transparency with these data center developers are currently operating under? Is a concern for Next 100, and we've talked about a little bit in previous. But curious, does this AI action plan do anything to meaningfully address some of these reliability and affordability concerns?
Yeah, I guess I would say, we know everyone's energy bills are going up, and this is the default trajectory because we have an aging electric grid. And so there are a lot of expenses on the transmission and distribution infrastructure side, but the bill increases are not coming from generation for the most part. And so, when the AI action plan is talking about increasing the efficiency of the electric grid using grid enhancing technologies and advanced conductors, that would help limit some of the future rise in energy bills because we're getting more out of our existing system. But if you're talking about keeping coal plants online longer, that is not a great affordability solution because these are old plants and they're expensive and they require a lot of maintenance. And that will increase the price of generation. And as I mentioned, the increases we're seeing now, they're not coming from generation. But if you start increasing that cost, now the bills are going to go up even more. And this year, the Trump administration issued an emergency order to keep a coal plant in Michigan online, the Consumers Energy coal plant. And it was for 5 weeks, and it cost Consumers Energy $29 million. So that is not an affordability solution. And so right now, wind and solar are some of the cheapest forms of energy generation. So if you want to keep that generation piece of your energy bills low, then it's good to keep interconnecting more wind and solar. You don't want to prioritize natural gas because right now there's a 5 to 7 year delay in terms of getting new gas turbines because we don't have that much manufacturing capacity in the United States. So that's not really a near-term solution. And, so I keep talking about, wind and solar being cheaper. We had tax credits are also helpful in powering these data centers, providing that clean energy. So rolling those back like we just did in that reconciliation bill, that is not a helpful solution for powering AI. And it doesn't help energy affordability either.
Fatima, that's super helpful. I want to actually go because I think it's a great follow-up question to Colin in the Q&A. Colin McGlynn asks, what clean energy policies are viable under this administration and Congress? And I think you're speaking to some of the ways that seem like, somewhat straightforward solutions to potentially tackle both reliability and affordability issues. But ideologically, it seems like maybe this administration is opposed to renewable energy. What's the wiggle room here? Is there an overlap, especially in this space?
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess I would say number one, whenever we talk about congressional permitting reform, we end up pairing a lot of different topics together. And so we have been including changes to how interstate transmission is planned and paid for and permitted in that larger conversation about permitting reform. And, the provisions that would make it easier to build fossil infrastructure are not necessarily what's going to help power AI. A lot of these tech companies have really ambitious clean power goals. But sometimes when we talk about permitting reform, we're actually talking about the transmission piece of it, which is the planning for transmission, the cost allocation, the siting of interstate transmission lines. And that is something that is basically essential. It's just sort of like an interesting fact of history that it is not all under federal jurisdiction right now on the siting side, because for gas pipelines, it all goes to FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. For interstate transmission, it's pretty much state by state. There's certain categories of transmission that can go to FERC. And I think this conversation around the need to power AI might force us to actually do something about improving transmission. So that's, if you're an optimist, like that's something that Congress could do. And then I also wanted to flag the Cheap Energy Act from Mike Levin of California and Sean Casten of Illinois. And I will put a link in the chat. This is a draft bill, but it's basically a collection of existing legislation that a lot of House members have come up with on lowering energy bills, making sure data centers are paying for their fair share when it comes to the new energy that needs to be built, restoring the tax credits for clean energy. And so I think these are the kinds of conversations we need to have if we want to be serious about powering AI. I'm not sure I can put it in the chat here, but I'll send it to Jonathan and maybe you can share it afterwards. The other thing I wanted to flag is right now I'm working with the SEEK Coalition in the House. That's 100 Democrats, Sustainable Energy and Environment Coalition. And there's a nonprofit that supports them, the SEEK Institute. And we have launched something called the Thriving Economy Project, where we're taking input from folks on what should the future of energy policy be, because we do have midterm elections coming up next year. And we want to have a sense for like, what are some pragmatic energy policy ideas? What's working out there in the states? So I would love if you all, if you'd be interested in your organizations, like submitting comments on what Congress should be doing in this space. That would be really helpful. But the Cheap Energy Act from Levin and Casten, that package of bills, that's really helpful. It tackles not just making sure we have enough clean energy for AI, but also making sure those energy bills are not so high that people can't pay them. And so it, increases funding for the low income home energy assistance program, LIHEAP, that can help pay energy bills so people don't lose access to power and have utility shutoffs. It talks about making sure that utilities have the right incentives to deploy grid enhancing technologies. You've heard me talk about this low hanging fruit often, right? Getting more out of the existing electric grid. And you might wonder, like, why isn't that being done already? And the answer is it might be that utilities don't have the financial incentives to deploy those because they get a return on investment, on capital investment, and these things often don't count as capital investment. So there might be some policy fixes that could help us be more efficient. And then, of course, energy efficiency across the board, like weatherization of people's homes, increasing energy efficiency across the economy. That seems like a no-brainer to avoid energy waste in this time when we need a lot of energy.
I have a quick follow-up question there too. I think one of the things that I see is a potential benefit of data centers and hyperscalers asking for more from the existing grid is the long overdue problem, as you've stated, of grid modernization and enhancing transmission capacity of existing systems. I think even before we've seen this big kind of data center and AI driven energy demand of, let's say, the last 2 to 3 years, grid modernization has been kind of a legacy problem where a lot of the current grid is, outdated by, and I'm not an expert here, so if anyone is, please, hop on and correct me. It's outdated by multiple decades, let's say. It does feel like this is potentially an opportunity to bring kind of that grid forward. What are some of the additional barriers or potential solutions? I'm hearing you say, especially where grid infrastructure for utilities requires some sort of financial incentive, is that a federal policy mechanism? Is that more a market-based mechanism? How do we incentivize and reduce barriers to modernizing the grid?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's so many things we can do. And so a lot of this is regulated at the state level. So I don't know if you all are familiar with Charles Hua and Power Lines. He's doing some really good work trying to get people engaged before their state energy commissions as consumers to push for policies that help us with decarbonization. And grid modernization seems like an easy one because it, would help increase energy affordability. So getting involved before your state commissions is great. At the federal level, the Department of Energy Grid Deployment Office gave out a lot of grants under the Grid Resilience and Innovation Partnerships Program to deploy cool technologies, partnerships between utilities and startups. Unfortunately, many of those grants have been frozen, but historically, the Department of Energy has played a big role in helping to deploy like smart grids. This was back in 2009. And historically, the Department of Energy has done a lot on grid modernization. But where we are right now, I think working with the state energy commissions makes a lot of sense. And one thing that I'm personally very excited about is now we have all these great AI tools that can help with grid modernization. So, for example, you might be familiar with this NEOM project in Saudi Arabia. It's sort of like this futuristic city. They want to power it all with 100% renewable energy. And they see using AI as an essential task to getting to 100% renewable energy because those AI tools can help you, one, predict the weather, predict load, vary up the management of the grid in response to real-time conditions really quickly, manage frequency and voltage changes. So then, we don't really talk about it as much in America because right now we're not talking about maximizing renewable energy deployment on the electric grid, but AI can actually help you with that. And it can actually also help prevent blackouts like we saw in Spain. And that was an issue not of generation, but of the frequency and voltage on the electric grid. It wasn't stable, but there are AI tools that can help with that. And there are AI tools that can help with resilience too. So you can detect when transmission lines are either damaged, like before they start a fire. And so on the resilience side, we have an aging electric grid. These AI tools are really helpful for that as well. So I think there's a lot of possibility here in a way that's either bipartisan or nonpartisan, just sort of more like local concerns, practical concerns. And I think that's kind of where we have to start.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm really excited about the possibilities there, and it's great to hear about international solutions where domestically we may be a little stuck in the mud right now. I think one of the things that's on our mind at Next 100 and is brought up by another question in the chat is some of the ways that this infrastructure requires a lot of different resource types. Specifically, to speak to this question, some of the water resource implications for data center development to cool these massive systems, particularly in water scarce regions and or regions that utilize a water rights system. I'll say just a couple of things here, and Fatima, I'm super curious to hear your thoughts as this intersects, I think, quite significantly with the energy generation conversation. One, would be super happy to share the recording and materials from the most previous webinar that we hosted at Next 100 Coalition with Krista Romero-Cardenas and Dr. Shaolin Ren about some of the water use implications of data center systems. I also think that there's an opportunity for the data center developers themselves to review the ways that their systems are requiring both direct and indirect water use systems. The very kind of brief synopsis that I would give in the kind of status quo of data centers is that where the technology itself within the data center is less water intensive to cool the server racks, it is often more energy intensive. And so even if there is less water resource demand on site, the current technologies do set up a condition so that there is, perhaps even more water resource uses for the energy that is off-site, and thus in especially kind of the systems of water rights in communities like the Southwest United States, difficult, I think, to keep track of and plan accurately by municipalities and water resource providers. But Fatima, I think I'm super curious to hear your perspective on how maybe renewable energy systems can play a role in reducing water resource uses, especially in some water scarce communities, if at all, or just your general thought.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's interesting. I'm less up to speed on the water issues, but I guess I would say, as you mentioned, instead of air cooling, you can do direct chip immersion, liquid cooling, and you can also use closed loop systems. So you're using, one set of water like over and over. So those are some solutions. It does kind of make you wonder, does it make sense to build such water intensive facilities in an area where water scarcity is very serious? I'm not sure. Most of the data center infrastructure, it is spread out across the country, but it is kind of clustered in hubs. And so you'll see a lot along the coasts. There's a lot in Northern Virginia because there's some subsea cables to Europe. And that's why there's so much data center build out in Loudoun County, because if you're closer to that subsea cable, then there's less latency or delay and internet connectivity. And so that's why you see a lot of data center infrastructure here and also on the West Coast because there's subsea cables to Asia. And so, I think right now, as energy is kind of like the limiting factor, people are looking to see where else can I build these data centers where I have access to energy. If you're going to build in water scarce regions, then you have to look for options that don't impose too much of a burden on local communities. But I'm not sure how it all pencils out in terms of like the cost of using less water intensive technologies for cooling, if you're comparing different regions of the country. So I think those are some factors that data center developers are considering.
Thanks. I'm going to move us into the dedicated question and answer section. Fatima, please feel free. I know I want to be respectful of folks' time as well as yours. We've got about 10 minutes before we wrap, and I'll do a very brief 2-minute closing. We've got about 8 more minutes to answer questions or bring additional points to the table. I want to make sure that we give time to this question specifically, Lance's question, who discusses tribes are often being removed from the AI conversation, feel antagonistic toward the industry and will continue to be so. And really want to highlight the kind of question here at the end of the question, which is really good. And I wish we had an opportunity to answer it all. Specifically speaking to some of the grid considerations. If tribes are on the same grid, they're often among those that receive the poorest service. How do we as tribes contend with that? Our neighbors who are so willingly max out their grid with no acknowledgement of their rural neighbors and how it might affect them. Curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think this is all about like how good is the policy making that goes into these decisions. And, my experience is more on the federal level. And so when I was a Hill staffer, we worked closely with like the National Congress of American Indians, and other groups to get their input on what does a national climate action plan look like that is beneficial to tribes and has their input. And I think that's the kind of thing that we need here too on AI and energy, AI and water. Where we are right now, I'm not sure if we're seeing that same type of outreach. I'm not sure. Maybe, you might know better than me, but certainly, this AI action plan was a result of a request for information on, what are some ideas that the Trump administration can do on AI. And, so it's one plan. I think that there's an opportunity to create additional plans that work better for tribes. And if you're working on the state level, I think trying to find partnerships with, you know, utilities and others to sort of try to highlight what are some alternative ways. Because, as I kind of mentioned, we can't really leave the future of AI up to the technologists. They don't really know all of the societal values that need to be considered. But it is a really challenging task. It's the space is moving really fast, and I think it can be hard to find forums to engage with data center developers on these issues. So, that you would hope that is where state and local governments come into play, but as the questioner mentions, that's not true all over the country.
I also want to name, thank you for that. I also want to name the responsibility of the utility commissions in any level of state or local government to engage in consultation with tribal nations, sovereign nations throughout the country. I think as somebody who grew up in New Mexico, it's something that I've been aware of for a long time, but want to put a call to action, especially as we're working across the NGO, grassroots, private, public, government sectors in this issue. Really creating more process-oriented advocacy within these local government and decision-making bodies. That tribal consultation has to be a part of this process. As you're saying, Fatima, it really has to do with the policymaking process in addition to the policy itself. And I think making sure that tribes have an equitable seat at the table to drive these resource conversations is just due diligence, respecting their sovereignty. I know that's also much easier said than done because of the historic inequities between the American government and tribal nations, state governments and tribal nations. But I think there are ways that those of us in the NGO space can be advocates for process and the rights of tribes as we're working across different issues, data centers being, I think, a key opportunity to raise those concerns. I'm going to keep us moving. I want to just acknowledge, I'm so sorry, I don't see your name. Your typing is anonymous, but specifically concerns about competing resource land use needs for agriculture versus the renewable energy industry. And I think there's really something here, not only where there are potentially competing needs between renewable energy resources and land uses such as agriculture, but as well as data centers and agricultural spaces. One of our colleagues who wasn't able to be with us today, Karen Miglo, had a recent opportunity to tour the data center alley space in kind of the greater DMV area, Northern Virginia. And it was the case that these developers were specifically targeting agricultural landscapes as spaces for potential development. Fatima, I'm super curious to hear your perspective on, how are there opportunities for renewable energy build out that also holds the concerns of agricultural communities And I think the broader piece of like, how are we using this land and how is it also benefiting local economies in terms of agriculture, tech-based workforce, just the kind of workforce and land use intersection in general.
Yeah, for sure. And admittedly, like I was not an agriculture staffer on the Hill. I was more of an energy staffer, but it is quite possible to co-locate solar and farmland. It's called agrovoltaics, right? And so on the one hand, it can diversify the income stream for the farmer. So in some cases, it is welcome because it is, privately leased, right? So if the farmer didn't want it there, it wouldn't be there, right? So I think if it's working well for the farmers, it gives them additional revenue. I think that's great. Um, and I think that land use obviously is an important issue. When it comes to data center siting, I think that's a good question. Like a lot of Loudoun County historically was farmland, probably like 40 some years ago. And now a lot of it is data centers. So, obviously we need to think about our land use and I think the Biden-Harris administration had a conservation goal of like 30 by 30. So I can't, claim to be super knowledgeable on land use issues, but I think there are ways to develop solar and also wind in agricultural or ranching areas. Another thing to raise, I think we talked a little bit about like how many jobs actually are there in data centers. And certainly, I think it will require a lot of electricians, and so that is helpful. But the larger point about workforce and opportunities is that what we don't want is like this transformational technology to lead to a result where all the benefits go to the folks with the most opportunities already to like a narrow band at the top. And so one thing we have to think about is like if we want to use AI for good, we need AI research in those areas and we need diverse AI researchers. We need historically Black colleges and universities, minority serving institutions to have access to the kinds of like high performance computing infrastructure, IT equipment, so that their students can participate in this transformation. And those are like an additional set of jobs that we should be thinking about, not just like operating the data center, but doing the research on like what can we use AI for farming. There's actually a lot of robotics in agriculture right now. Like there's laser weeding, there's all sorts of like really practical implementations of using AI to support all sectors of the economy. And what we want is we want those opportunities to be available to a broad swath of the population, not just a few. So I think that is something that is worth considering. And, on the federal level, honestly, there's not that much AI policy. This action plan is like one of the first things that we've seen, but there is an existing program at the National Science Foundation called the National AI Research Resource, and it was giving out funding to universities, HBCUs, minority serving institutions, so that they would have the chips to be able to do that kind of research. And so I think those kind of programs are really helpful on the R&D side.
Thank you, Fatima. Yeah, I'm excited that there's also opportunities to think about inclusive workforce solutions in this new industry. I think there's a lot of people making commitments that this is going to be something that changes workforce dynamically, but I am seeing less and less concrete examples of how that's being put into implementation. So excited to hear that folks are working on that and there's opportunities to connect. I want to just 60 seconds to wrap us up today. Apologies to folks who I wasn't able to get to their questions. Thank you all so much for your comments and questions. Appreciate the engagement. And just want to lead us on some next steps. First of all, we're excited to host a AI list group. If you're interested in signing up, we'll have information on how to do that in the follow-up email to this session. We're also taking on a couple of pieces around doing some work in educating legislators about the SANDBOX Act. we're going to be releasing a toolkit and some additional materials for folks to help support in that direction. So look for that as part of follow-up, or if you've got any questions or ideas there, please feel free to follow up. And then finally, we're really excited to host a couple of environmental policy forums around the data center issue later this year as we kind of close out the calendar year at Next 100. This is the fourth in our series of webinars, but we want to give an opportunity for folks to share their feedback around different policy solutions and practices at the state and federal level around what is needed for AI policy development, and really continue the conversation that we have started today and in previous sessions. So if you're interested in that, there will also be an opportunity for you to join. It'll be a couple of forums with dates to be announced in mid to late November before we get into the holidays. So look for the follow-up email if you're registered for this webinar. You'll receive that plus a recording and the slides for this presentation. But finally, I want to close just again by saying thank you so much, Fatima, for joining us. Really appreciate your wisdom, insight, and experience in this space, and also the work that's happening to bring some of these alternative policy pieces to light and fruition in Congress and across the AI and energy space. So thank you so much. And thanks to everyone who took time to attend this. Really excited to continue collaborating with you all. Thank you.
Thank you.